In this video, I'm going to show you what a limiter is, its basic controls, and 3 common applications in which I'd use limiting in my tracks. So let's get started. What is up everyone? My name is Daniel and I am the founder of SoundShock. Before we get started, I just want to let you guys know that I release tutorials on the SoundShock YouTube channel every other week on all things electronic music production related when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement. So go ahead and click the subscribe button and the bell notification next to it so you don't miss when I release a new video. And before we get into this tutorial video, I want to strongly urge you guys to watch my previous tutorial on how to use a compressor, as I go over the basics of dynamics, a compressor, and a compressor's basic controls. And all of this is essential to knowing how a limiter functions. So if you don't have a solid understanding of dynamics and what a compressor is, then go ahead and go down to the descriptions and click the link to the tutorial on how to use a compressor. And then come back on over to this video. Also, if you are already familiar with limiters, I'd love to know how you use them in your tracks, so go ahead and put that in the comments below. Now, a lot of producers may know about limiters and may have even used them in their tracks, but are still unclear on how they function, how they are different from compressors, and the common situations in which to apply limiting. So that is what we're going to go over in this video. So what is a limiter? A limiter is a type of compressor designed for a specific purpose, to limit the level of a signal to a certain threshold. A compressor gradually reduces the signal level above a certain threshold. But a limiter completely prevents a signal from going over a specified setting, a limit that nothing can go over. A limiter is like a compressor, set to a very high compression ratio. Remember that the compression ratio is the strength of the compressor. A limiter will have a ratio of at least 10:1, and most commonly, the ratio will be at infinity to 1, meaning the entire signal above the threshold is attenuated. If you take a look at the graph, you can see that with a 1:1 ratio, nothing is happening. No compression or limiting is happening, and the output level is the same as the input level. As we go to 2:1, the signal above the threshold is getting attenuated a small amount, and the output level is slightly lower. Then a stronger ratio of 4:1 gives an even lower output level. Then the 8:1 ratio, which is a very strong ratio. We can see that the output level is again lower. Then finally the limiter, which has the infinity to 1 ratio. We can see that once the threshold is hit, the output level remains the same as it is being limited. Now let's go over the basic parameters of a limiter. Now, some limiters may have more parameters than the ones that I go over, but I just want to go over the main ones so you guys can start applying all the information that I'm giving you right after watching this tutorial and without confusing you guys. So limiters have 3 main controls. The first one is the threshold. Like a compressor, the threshold control is used to set the level at which the signal is compressed, and in this case, at which level the signal is limited. How much the signal gets turned down depends on how far the signal is above the threshold. It's also important to take note of the attenuation or gain reduction meter, which shows you how many decibels the limiter is limiting. So when we reduce the threshold, the limiter is working harder to ensure that no audio is getting past the threshold. Next is the ceiling. This is used to set the maximum output level. This ensures that we set the total output of our audio at the level we want it to be at, and to keep it from clipping. You can see that the audio is not passing our ceiling, which is set to -1 decibels. You can take a look at your channel strip and see the peak meter, and it is not passing -1 decibels. And last is the release. The release of a limiter also functions similarly to that of a compressor. The release is how quickly or slowly the attenuation of the limiting is restored to 0 or no limiting. The human ear naturally responds to change. The faster the change, the more we like it, or the more we are aware of it. So if you have a faster release time, then the signal tends to make the audio sound louder, and slower release times make it sound quieter and duller. So let's have a listen to what this sounds like. When setting the release, you usually want a fast release for very short but loud transients to avoid uneven dips in volume and retain loudness, and a slow release for moderate peaks in your audio so that a more gentle level control is applied. The reason that limiters usually don't have an attack control is that they are dealing with high amplitude transients. So letting any of the original signal in through an attack would defeat the purpose. So they are usually set internally with a very short attack time or no attack time at all. So now that we know the basic functions of a limiter, let's go over 3 common situations in which all use limiting for. Now the first situation in which we'd use a limiter is to provide an audio safety net. Oftentimes, when you do heavy processing on individual sounds, groups of sounds, or even your master chain, sometimes the audio can produce erratic dynamics and create very sharp transients that are very high in amplitude that could harm your audio system and your ears. These erratic dynamics will create digital distortion and clipping, which is the last thing that we want. So what I like to do is I like to add a limiter to the end of my master chain here. And this will be the last thing on the mastering chain. Now this is different from a mastering limiter, as once again, we want this limiter just to catch the erratic peaks that happens when we are processing our sounds. Now for the settings of our limiter. Now for these examples, I'm going to be using the Waves L1 limiter, as it has a nice graphical display and it will be easy to get across the points that I'm trying to make in this tutorial. But really, any limiter will do here, as most limiters have these 3 basic controls: the threshold, output ceiling, and release. So don't think you need to use the Waves L1 limiter. And in the descriptions to the video, I have added the top 7 free VST limiters on the web right now for you guys to download and start using in your tracks. So definitely check those out and start using the techniques in this tutorial with the free limiters. And now for the settings for the limiter. The threshold will be at 0 decibels, as well as the output ceiling. Once again, we only want to be reducing the audio when a high dynamic peak comes in, so we can avoid clipping and digital distortion. So we want the threshold and output ceiling to be at its modest settings, as we don't want the limiter to be working at any other time. And for the release, we're going to have it at its fastest time, as fast release times are meant for high transient material. If we had a slower release, once the high transient material passes, then the limiter would be slow in going back to 0 decibels, and there would be a noticeable volume difference. So once again, you would put this on your master chain when you are working throughout your song. I usually like to put this on at the very first thing before I even start my track. Another use of this safety net limiter is to use it when you are recording, whether that be a guitar, drums, a vocal. Throwing this limiter on at the end of your recording chain will help keep any of your audio from going into digital distortion and clipping. So let's have a listen to how this would work. I have a vocal here. In the very end of the vocal, the singer is a little too close to the microphone, the volume is much greater, and it is clipping. So let's have a listen.
Rock the dance floor, rock the dance floor.
So as you can hear at the very end, there is clipping. Now if we had a limiter on when we were recording this, then it wouldn't go into clipping. So now we will throw a limiter on and listen to what it sounds like with this limiting.
Rock the dance floor, rock the dance floor, rock the dance floor.
As you can hear, attenuation is happening when the louder part of the vocal comes in, and we avoid clipping. So that is situation number 1, provide an audio safety net. The second situation in which we'd use limiting is to sculpt our sounds. Oftentimes when we have high transient audio, whether that be leads or drums or anything that has a sharp attack, these sounds can eat up headroom in our mix, especially if you are layering high transient material together, such as drums. The peaks of these transients will come together and create a very high amplitude transient, which throws off the dynamics of your song, as the rest of the elements in your track will be quieter, and then when this high transient material comes in, there will be a very sharp peak. So I have a drum sample here with a very high peak that is eating up a lot of headroom in the mix unnecessarily, and then we will go into the limiter and sculpt this sound. So the peaks are a bit more tame and the dynamics will be reduced and it will fit better in with the mix. So let's have a listen to the high transient percussion. While this seems like a normal percussion hit, the attack of this percussion is very sharp and eating up a lot of headroom. We could of course turn the volume of the percussion down, but this would still leave the very high transient attack intact. So we want to sculpt the transient of this attack to have the dynamics fit in better with your track. So for the controls of the limiter, we will adjust the threshold as we are listening to the audio, and the output ceiling we will leave at 0 decibels. And then the release is at its fastest time, as once again we are dealing with short high transient material and we want the limiter to recover as quickly as possible. So let's go ahead and adjust the threshold while listening to the percussion. As you can see, we're doing a lot of gain reduction on the audio, as once again we want to sculpt this sound by reducing the short high transient in the percussion. So now let's have a look at the waveforms of the two different percussion. On the left is the percussion that is not limited, and on the right, the percussion is the waveform that is limited. As you can see, we have cut off the high transient material. There was a lot less of a peak in the percussion after we have done our limiting. And you can also hear the difference where the unlimited percussion has a very sharp biting attack and the limited percussion is more balanced. You can hear that sharp little tick in the unlimited percussion that will create an unbalance and eat up headroom in your mix. So once again, sharp transient audio in your tracks can eat up unnecessary headroom and create an unbalance in your mix. So using a limiter to tame these peaks is a great way to handle it. And then the third common situation in which I'll use limiting is at the very end of my mastering chain as a brick wall limiter or mastering limiter. The mastering limiter is used to increase the perceived volume of your entire track so it can stand up to the loudness of all the other commercial tracks. And this is a lot different from situation 1, as in situation 1, it was just to provide an audio safety net. With this mastering limiter, our goal is to bring up the volume of our final track. Now when we do this master limiting, what's going to happen is the quieter audio in your track is going to be brought up in volume and the louder peaks are going to be reduced in volume. Now the threshold control, we're going to adjust when we are listening to the track. With our output ceiling, we're going to move it down to negative 0.3 decibels. The reason we don't have our ceiling to 0 decibels is we want to ensure that we leave enough room for intersample peaking. Without getting too technical here, depending on which system you play your song out on, if we had a ceiling of 0 decibels, there still could be distortion. So I like to leave a little bit of a ceiling here, so I make sure that my track does not distort or go into digital clipping on any system that it is played on. Some might say that negative 3 decibels should be your desired ceiling, but today's tracks are very loud, so having the highest possible ceiling before it distorts is ideal. In the release time, we will keep it around 3 milliseconds here. We'll be adjusting the release after we adjust the threshold. We want to find the sweet spot where the limiter sounds transparent and there is no noticeable dip in volume in the transients of the track work in unison with the release. So let's have a listen to our track first, and then we'll start adjusting the threshold and the release. So now let's adjust our threshold. Now once again, today's tracks are very loud and limiters are pushed quite hard, especially with electronic music. So I'm going to be pulling down the threshold until I start hearing distortion, and then pull it back until I don't hear any more distortion. That is usually where I'm going to be placing the threshold on my master chain limiter. So at negative 13.2 decibels threshold, we can hear that there's starting to be some distortion. So let's go ahead and reel the threshold back a little bit. So around a negative 10.7 decibels of threshold, you can hear the single is nicely boosted without hearing any distortion. And we had around 5 decibels of gain reduction. And for the release, we can hear that this song has a lot of high transient material, sounds cutting in and out with a lot of drum fills. So having a short release here is ideal. Let's go ahead and adjust it. So around 2.57 milliseconds of release is what gels best with the track. So once again, we have used this master limiter to boost the perceived loudness of our track and make it able to compete with the loudness of other commercial records. So referring back to situation number 2, where we use limiting to sculpt our sounds. If we had very high amplitude, transient percussion in our track and did not sculpt those sounds like we did in the second example, then what would happen is the limiter would cause distortion quicker when we turn down the threshold, as these high peaks would cause the limiter to trigger when the rest of the audio is not at this high amplitude, causing the limiter to work harder and once again distort faster. And this in turn would keep you from being able to turn up the perceived loudness of your tracks and get it to the commercial loudness level that you want. So once again, keeping your dynamics in check is important for the overall mix and master of your song. Now once again, these are just 3 common situations in which I'll use limiting. There are of course other situations, but I just wanted to give you guys the 3 most common situations. Thanks for checking out the video, everyone. I hope by watching this tutorial, you now have a better understanding of how a limiter functions and how you can apply it in your tracks in a positive way. Before I let you go, I just want to let you know that I have done a complete redesign of the SoundShock audio website. The site is now much more visually appealing and much easier to navigate through all the awesome content that is put up on SoundShock. All that awesome content includes free plugins, presets, samples, and KONTAKT instruments, as well as production-based artist interviews where I ask professional artists specific questions about their production process. So this is a great section for you guys to learn tips from the pros. And not to forget the tutorial section of the website where all these videos and tons of other tutorial videos are put up for you guys to learn all things electronic music production. So once again, thank you for stopping by. And if you want to learn more tips when it comes to mixing, mastering, sound design, and arrangement, go ahead and click the subscribe button right here. See you guys later.